I looked it up. I said, which state has the lowest percentage of obesity in America? And it was Colorado, which has these high elevation cities like Denver, Mile High City. The highest elevated town in America, Victor, Colorado. So, I mean, come on, this is, very interesting stuff, and it might provide some health benefits for folks who are struggling with a variety of different issues.
Canola oil is one of the healthiest cooking oils. When the canola seed arrives at the processing factory, it contains foreign material, mostly plant pieces. The seeds pass by a magnet. It removes any metal that may have fallen in during the journey from field to factory.
What are you eating right now? Are you eating self-hatred? Today I want to do a quick program about the information from the late, great Dr. Ray Peat, who we had on this program several times before he passed, unfortunately, a few years ago now. And we got to know him for a few years and glean some insights from him and interact with his ideas with other folks coming on the program as well. But one of the things that we didn't get to talk to him about as much was his insights into the potential health benefits of living in high altitude environments and the ability for those environments to have tremendous health benefits. It reminds me of Matthew chapter 5, 14 through 16, which says, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house." So important to have sunlight, so important to have access to, I guess, at least some part of your time, if you have that opportunity to be in a high altitude setting. And again, it's a topic that I'm learning about, actively trying to understand. As someone who lives in Florida, we don't have a lot of altitude over here. And so a lot of people feel the need to retire in a place like Florida. I think perhaps ideally, if one could afford it, which is a big if, especially in our economy today, I guess the snowbirds might have it right, theoretically. If one were to live, at least in the winter months, in the sunshine of Florida, you get all that good sunlight, you get all that good orange juice during the winter months that our citrus season's going on, and then to be able to go to the northern climate, perhaps in a high elevation environment, is a healthier place for your body, for your mitochondria, for your metabolism even. So we're going to get into a little bit about what Dr. Ray Peat has said about high altitude living. And it reminds me, again, I'm not saying when I read these Bible passages, I'm not saying that that was the, literal intention of the author writing these stories, that he was talking about getting high altitude health benefits. Okay. I'm not making a dumb level analysis there. What I'm talking about is learning how to use insights from the scripture in ways in which the early church fathers used their hermeneutic, where they were using multiple layers of meaning and gleaning insights and different dimensions of our lives that you can find in some of the stories that we hear about Mount Zion, being in a high altitude environment. That is the city of God, is on a hill in a high altitude environment. When Jesus says he says, go to run to the hills when things are going crazy, right? The healthy environment to be in a high altitude environment, perhaps. And especially when times are stressful, which would take a toll on your mitochondria. It takes a toll on your health. I want to get into some of the writings of Dr. Ray Peat. Let's see some quotes from Dr. Ray Peat from raypeatexplain.com. Here's a quote from Ray Peat's newsletter from November 2020. High metabolic rates association with longevity at altitude. In one study, T3 was 4.5 times higher in people living at a high altitude. T4 was about 3 times higher, and TSH, a promoter of inflammation, was reduced by more than 25%. The high altitude studies show very convincingly that a high metabolic rate is strongly associated with greater longevity and better health. Lifestyle choices to slow aging and enhance longevity, altitude, and a milk-based diet are obviously two important thermogenic factors that slow the accumulation of harmful adaptations. But there are many other controllable factors that could extend longevity even more. Reducing inflammatory factors is important, and personal choices can make a big difference. For example, choosing easily digestible foods to reduce endotoxin, avoiding the polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFA, that interfere with cell respiration and form inflammatory prostaglandins, avoiding antioxidant supplements that create a reductive excess, and choosing foods that contain anti-inflammatory thermogenic compounds such as citrus fruits with their high content of flavonoids that support cell respiratory functions. Again, that's another one from Ray Peat's newsletter. Here's one from his book, Mind and Tissue, Russian Research Perspectives on the Human Brain. The changes Mearson's group has seen in high-altitude therapy resemble the changes that occurred during supplementation with thyroid and antioxidants. The lower concentration of oxygen in tissues at high elevation would increase the antioxidant reserves of the organism, making it more resistant to stress. Decreasing the use of dietary unsaturated fats, PUFA, similarly protects against oxidative stress. Here's another one from his Ray Peat's newsletter. Oxygen delivery and glycolytic activation in working muscles. At low altitude, when a tissue's oxygen consumption increases beyond the blood's ability to deliver oxygen, as in an intensely working muscle, the tissue activates the glycolytic process, converting glucose to lactic acid as a source of additional energy. Another quote from Ray Peat. Neglecting the role of carbon dioxide in suppressing the formation of lactic acid, they also neglect all of its other essential metabolic effects, including its role as the factor whose absence results in the syndromes of altitude sickness. Now, this is interesting to me, folks, because I remember at the beginning of that pandemic we had, the disease that should not be named, that there were people all over New York City's healthcare system saying they had never seen symptoms like this. The patients were coming in, being put on oxygen masks that were not with the carbon dioxide, that had that pure, rarefied, that 100% oxygen put into patients. And then many of those doctors were reporting, I remember early on in 2020 saying, oh, these patients are exemplifying altitude sickness. And they said, where is this altitude sickness symptoms coming from? Well, they were forcing their bodies to put this level of oxygen that was not conducive for their health and healing. How many people during that pandemic had that very same thing? And then having that pure oxygen, right, that doesn't have the level of carbon dioxide that high altitude environment provides. It's insane to think how many people were lost for no reason. How much trauma happened around those losses and still continues on. Another quote from Ray Peat's newsletter, using calcium channel blockers and acetazolamide to treat the new disease because of their therapeutic effect in high altitude pulmonary edema. He didn't mention it, but both of these drugs can correct the tissue deficiency of carbon dioxide. Quote from the same newsletter, for several decades, high-altitude physiologists have been perplexed by what they call the lactate paradox, the fact that exercise at high altitude with less oxygen produces less increase in lactic acid in the blood than it does at sea level, allowing quicker recovery, since it is understood that it is oxidative metabolism that prevents the formation of lactic acid. The lower oxygen availability should lead to a higher lactate content at high altitude and slower recovery. From a 1999 newsletter, from Ray Peat's newsletter, carbon CO2 loss impact on brain circulation and hyperventilation effects. The loss of carbon dioxide reduces brain circulation, creating complex paresthesias and stroke symptoms. Hyperventilation is a relative term and refers to the amount of carbon dioxide which is lost from the blood. Heavy, rapid breathing at high altitude or in the presence of carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere doesn't necessarily constitute hyperventilation. Remember Diamond Dallas Page, the wrestling icon and fitness guru. He was on my program. He was able to do all kinds of different marvelous feats of health and strength. He said one of the key things America's missing is its ability to learn how to breathe in deeply and to be able to control one's breath instead of hyperventilating. That literally, hyperventilation is associated with the stress state, which affects your body's health on so many different foundational levels. Altitude's impact, the 1997 newsletter, altitude's impact on lactate accumulation during exercise. It has been found that during intense exercise, which always produces a lactic acid accumulation in the blood, a lower peak accumulation of lactate occurs at high altitude. And this seems to be caused by a reduction in the rate of glycolysis or glucose consumption. So it's just fascinating to see so many different thoughts from Dr. Ray Peat. Now the question is, how high do you need to get? I think, there seems to be information that every 1,000 feet you can go up, you get to have more health benefits each 1,000 feet that you can handle healthily, and it takes time to adjust to that environment for a lot of people, especially if they're severely sick or, had metabolic impairment to a serious degree. But, just seeing another quote from Dr. Ray Peat, people who live at very high altitudes live significantly longer. They have lower incidence of cancer, citing Weinberg, 1987, and heart disease, Mortimer, 1977, and other degenerative conditions than people who live at near sea level. As I've written earlier, I think the lower energy transfer from cosmic radiation is likely to be a factor in their longevity, but several kinds of evidence indicate that it is the lower oxygen pressure itself that makes the biggest contribution to their longevity. K.P. Buteyko believed that increased carbon dioxide in the body fluids sometimes cause cancers to disappear. In many studies over the last 40 years, and the trend can also be seen in insurance statistics published in 1912, it is clear that cancer mortality is much lower at high altitude. Under all conditions studied, the characteristic lactic acid metabolism of stress and cancer is suppressed at high altitude as respiration is made more efficient. The Haldane effect shows that carbon dioxide retention is increased at high altitude. Studying athletes at sea level and at a high altitude, it was seen that less lactic acid is produced by maximal exercise at high altitude than at sea level. Since oxygen deficiency in itself tends to cause the formation of lactic acid, this has been called the lactate paradox. The expectation was that the more lactic acid would be formed, yet less was produced. Something was turning off the production of lactic acid. Normally, it is oxidative respiration that turns off glycolysis and lactic acid production, so that in exercise beyond the ability of the body to deliver oxygen, and in cancer with its respiratory defect, glycolysis produces lactic acid. So something is happening at high altitude which turns off glycolysis. The Haldane effect is a term for the fact that hemoglobin gives up oxygen in the presence of carbon dioxide and releases carbon dioxide in the presence of oxygen. It is the increased retention of carbon dioxide that accounts for the lactate paradox. Carbon dioxide activates the Krebs cycle, but it also combines with ammonium, and in doing so deactivates glycolysis because ammonium activates a regulatory enzyme. At high elevation, carbon dioxide is retained and lactic acid formation is suppressed. This is called the Pasteur effect, but altitude physiologists haven't begun thinking in these directions. Comparing very low altitude, Jordan Valley, over 1,000 feet below sea level, with moderate altitude, 620 meters above sea level, ACTH was increased in runners after a race only at the low altitude, indicating that the stress reaction was prevented by a moderate increase of altitude. And he cites this, L. Megiddo, 1996. The perspective we get on cancer from the high altitude studies allows us to go beyond the specific issue of cancer to the more general issue of stress and regeneration. An outline, stress alters the physical nature of the cellular substance in a way that activates the cell. in which case it will either die from exhaustion or grow into new cells. The replacement of injured cells means that mutation need not accumulate, and this renewal with elimination of mutant cells has been observed in sun-damaged skin. Among the many layers of form-generating and form-sustaining systems, the balance of electrical fields has a basic place. The reason for mountain sickness and the reasons for the low incidence of heart disease, cancer, cataracts at high altitude offer clues to the prevention of death and deterioration from many other causes. So it's very interesting, these facts that I think people need to have more exposure to see if that might provide some remediation for some of the problems or preventative measures, therapeutic benefit, even if you can be in a high altitude environment just for a month. There's some ideas that it might have up to a year of benefit just to be there for a month breathing in that air. So, then there's also the fact that, I remember I searched for, that there's altitude association with higher altitude is associated with less obesity, which again is another indicator of metabolic dysfunction. Upon all those other diseases are included within that metabolic dysfunction. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, other issues that are very common in America. And I looked it up. I said, which state has the lowest percentage of obesity in America? And it was Colorado, which has these high elevation cities like Denver, Mile High City. The highest elevated town in America, Victor, Colorado. So, I mean, come on, this is, very interesting stuff, and it might provide some health benefits for folks who are struggling with a variety of different issues. So take a chance, go to the mountains, do it safely, healthy. You have issues and get back to me. I want to hear your thoughts. Email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com. Talk again soon.